StarCraft is a great game, but it's also a bad game. But that's what makes it a great game. Of all the places we could begin, I thought I'd start with Warcraft I. To arrive at what makes StarCraft such a great and bad game, we kinda have to look at where we began with the genre in Blizzard's hands and where we ended up to find where StarCraft sits in the timeline of RTS evolution. Blizzard is by no means the only name in RTS, and its IPs are certainly not the only dominant franchises in the business. But we are going to focus on their entries in particular because we can see the choices they've made over the decades of development, the things they decided were improvements, and what they decided to ignore at the time of release. And so, we begin with Warcraft Orcs and Humans, or Warcraft 1 as we will call it. Playing Warcraft 1 today is a bit of a trip. If you aren't an RTS gamer or are an RTS gamer of the modern day playing games like StarCraft II, Warcraft 3, or whatever the latest iteration of Command & Conquer is, you're probably going to have a wild experience picking up Warcraft 1 today. The game is incredibly clunky. It's slow and very bare. There were two races available to the player, the Orcs and the Humans, and they were largely similar. Each race had a total of 8 buildings they could make, and a tech tree of buildings and upgrades that followed the exact same path. For instance, they both had lumber mills that unlocked their first ranged unit, and stables that unlocked their first mounted units. The blacksmith had the same upgrades, each had a building each for their 2 spellcaster units, and that was about it. Even the campaigns were incredibly similar. They both started with identical building missions, 1 dungeon crawl mission without building, and the rest of 7 missions that escalated in difficulty, which were just build stuff and destroy enemy base missions. There were so many features that we consider standard in the genre today that simply weren't there yet. Units were expensive in ratio to resources gathered, making the game kinda slow. There were no actual health numbers on the units and buildings, just a color bar. There were no static defense buildings, there were no control groups, there were no rally points, there were no building queues, there was no fog of war, and a whole lot of other things that I won't list down right now. The game played okay, especially when compared to what else was in the space at the time, mainly Dune 2 and eventually Command & Conquer. The mechanics were actually a lot easier to manage when compared to the even clunkier Dune menu management. The problem with Dune 2 was this: the sidebar was almost just a hotkey. It displayed what you had currently selected that particular building to build, and in order to change what was currently selected, you had to go into another submenu which actually took you away from the game screen. Warcraft made the brilliant decision to simply shrink everything down into the sidebar. When you clicked on a peasant to build a building, all the options would show up in the sidebar itself as icons instead of full graphics. When you clicked on the barracks, you had the option of everything the barracks could train right there for you to choose in the sidebar. And also each had its own hotkey, which made the process of cycling through all the things you could make incredibly simple and effective. Command & Conquer would make a similar update to its UI, but again with some very distinctive choices. Unit controls were still horrible though. The one thing Warcraft did to help was to highlight all the hotkeys required to manipulate basically anything on screen, but proper unit commands was something the Westwood boys would do so much better in the coming year. But Warcraft II would up it even more. We'll talk about that later, I promise. We'll also talk a lot more about the asymmetrical nature of the game in a future video, but I'd like to touch on it here just a little bit. Warcraft 1 was far more symmetrical than its modern day counterparts. Where the races differed was in the spells that the spellcasters had, and for some very strange reason, the range of the spearmen and the archers. That's it. And that's the game. Revisiting this thing today really gives you the feeling of how shallow of a game it was. I don't really remember how I felt about it at the time, but I do know that I reinstalled it several times over to replay it in its entirety over a few years. Maybe we were just used to that depth of a game back then, or maybe I just had very little to play. You can check out my gaming history series to see just how pathetic my gaming history actually is. But there was enough success there and enough buzz about the genre at the time and enough growth in the PC gaming world, that period of time was really dominated by the home console, that warranted another attempt by Blizzard. They took what they knew, thought about what could be improved, and set about creating Warcraft II. Warcraft II released just 1 year later. That's insane considering the amount of content they added. It is greater in scale by a significant degree. The game was bigger in every measurable way. Heck, even the graphics were bigger thanks to the growth in both resolution and in general monitor sizes. But first, the biggest thing Warcraft II did was create perhaps the greatest use of the 2-button mouse in all of video gaming. While Command & Conquer created more complex mouse commands by pairing it with the alternate and control keys on the keyboard, Warcraft II created the essential left-click, right-click commands that would become a standard for not just Blizzard RTS games, but even other games outside this genre. Left-click selects the thing, right-click tells it what to do. You left-click the peon, you right-click the gold mine. You left-click the grunt, you right-click the footman. It's that simple. And it was a genius bit of game development. It is the most intuitive UI ever created. So much so that none of this is ever really tutorialized at any level for all of the foreseeable future. Warcraft II introduced us to more units, more buildings, 33% more resources to manage, and more than double the amount of units in a group you could control at one time. Still no labeled control groups though. That was something Red Alert would do first. Alright, quick edit from the editing bay. I was researching a little bit more about when control groups were added into Warcraft II because the version that I'm playing is the Battle.net edition and they did patch in control groups into that game. But when I researched it a little bit more, I kind of found out that maybe right-clicking wasn't even in Warcraft II. Maybe that was a StarCraft thing entirely. So because I don't have access to the original Warcraft 2 game, I can't actually verify this for myself. So I'm just gonna have to trust Wiki and right-clicking was introduced in StarCraft, not in Warcraft 2. Apologies. But they also introduced a second dimension to their games. The vertical dimension. It's strange to think that a mechanic that was arguably introduced in Dune 2 was completely ignored by Warcraft 1. It took a whole new game before Blizzard figured out air units. And with this new dimension, we had a whole new thing to think about now because only some units could attack up. On top of this, Warcraft 2 also introduced us to new terrain, the sea. Water was now not just a barrier to the map, but it was also traversable with ships. We had islands now and the possibility of being attacked from all sides, which in turn led to the creation of static defense buildings. There were now orc and human towers that attack enemies automatically, and guess how long before the tower rush was invented in multiplayer games? And then a big one that Warcraft 2 introduced was new damage types and damage calculation. Warcraft 2 introduced the math of basic damage, piercing damage, and magic damage, and also armor as the opposite factor to these damage types. I'm not going to go into depth about how damage is calculated in Warcraft 2, but it meant new things for how certain units dealt more or less damage to different levels of armor and different levels of upgrades. All in all, the emphasis on upgrades became a more prominent thing, not just amassing more units. The game also introduced a couple of small things that would go on to become big things in future games. For one, Warcraft 2 gave us non-attack units for the first time. Units specifically meant for scouting. And you needed these scouting units because Warcraft 2 also introduced the Fog of War. It also introduced the first unit and building evolutions, turning archers and axe throwers into rangers and berserkers, ogres into mages and knights into paladins. The strongholds and town halls were now upgradable, creating new complexities in the tech tree's progression paths of both races. And it also introduced cool little aesthetic things like better attack animations, unit and building specific voices and sounds, unit and building health numbers under their health bars, and neutral units like pigs and sheep. I mean, that sounds insignificant, but when we get to Brood War, it's actually going to be a functional thing. Just look out for that. And of course, with the new game came a ton more asymmetry, which, as I said, we'll talk a lot more about later. And the last thing I want to touch on is Warcraft II gave us our very first expansion pack, Beyond the Dark Portal. It's a strange expansion pack by today's standards, firstly because of the fact that there are no expansion packs anymore, just DLC all the way. But also, even in comparison to the expansion packs that we are familiar with, it was a little bit odd. It was strictly a story expansion pack, so no new things other than new missions and a continuation of the story and a couple of new multiplayer maps. That's it. This again is going to be important because the very concept of expansion packs was something that Blizzard would go on to perfect later. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's going to be a whole different video. But anyway, Beyond the Dark Portal released a year after Warcraft II, after Red Alert had already come out. But because it was mainly a story expansion, we would not yet be treated to a ton of new features Blizzard was sure to be working on since Red Alert's incredible game-changing mechanics. That would take another 2 full years later before the world was hit by StarCraft. StarCraft finally introduced us to Blizzard's take on control groups, but they still limited the size of groups to 12. It's interesting to note that Red Alert, a game made in 1995, already had the mechanic of AI pathing solved for infinite group sizes, and it would take a while, read 17 years later, before Blizzard took advantage of this idea for StarCraft II. There's a reason for this though, and it has to do with the level of complexity Blizzard was introducing into their units. I know I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about the Westwood side of things, but the comparison to Red Alert is particularly interesting. Red Alert had very few units and variations in their entire unit set, whereas StarCraft introduced a host of units that had a variety of collision sizes, move speeds, attack rates, and animation timings. And so, Blizzard's AI pathing is kind of a hilarious nightmare, and it works so much better to limit the control groups to 12. I mean, if you've ever tried to send 10 control groups of Zerglings across the map and watched the conga line and compared it to Red Alert's tanks moving out, you'll realize how silly StarCraft seemed to be. But StarCraft also introduced a whole bunch of changes to the genre. For one, the economy was totally revamped. Primary and secondary resources had swapped places in terms of how they were mined, where you used to have a queue of workers going into a gold mine and unlimited workers chopping trees. StarCraft now had a ton of mineral patches you could mine from and a limited entry into the Vespene geyser. The numbers were also scaled down dramatically. Warcraft started with the economy in the hundreds and thousands. One worker brought 100 gold from the mine and a footman was 400 gold. StarCraft saw 8 resources from each mining cycle. Yes, 8 from 100. That's a big change. But units were also cheaper, but in terms of scale, more expensive. The Marine was 50 minerals, requiring 7 mining cycles. But more workers could collect resources at any given time, so things started slower but scaled up quicker. This meant making more units as the game progressed and the economies of the game scaled, with up to 20 or 30 workers chipping away at minerals at each base. This change of economy would change the entire pace of the game. We'll talk a lot more about this later. Damage numbers were kept interestingly small-ish. Building hit points were still in the hundreds and thousands, but actual damage from the units were in the single digits, up to about 20-ish max. This, combined with the fact that units were now much cheaper in relation to the amount of resources gathered overall, meant that the armies got a lot bigger, and fights became more engaged and more exciting. On top of this, StarCraft now expanded on the concept of damage types and damage calculation in the game. There were now 3 distinct types of damage that dealt different percentages of damage according to the size classification of units: explosive, concussive, and normal. So it became a new gameplay mechanic where some units were specifically more powerful against others, meaning that it wasn't just about higher numbers, but also about army composition. StarCraft also took the vertical dimension we talked about and added terrain changes like high ground and low ground, which affected both unit accuracy and vision. Again, Red Alert may have introduced this first, but it became a much bigger deal in StarCraft, with ramps and defensible squeeze points being an integral part of the game's strategies. StarCraft also introduced the mechanic of invisible units and detector units and buildings to see those invisible units. And of course, the asymmetry increased to a now ridiculous degree, which meant that the playstyles of each race was now so unique that most people had to pick just one and stick with it. This would inadvertently be the foundation on which the world of modern esports would be built upon. But again, that will be the topic of another video. But there are also a ton of little tidbits that StarCraft added to the genre that sometimes go unappreciated. One of those things was the unit info section at the bottom of the UI, which included damage numbers, current damage and armor upgrade levels, and of course a simple unit icon. This icon, however, also showcased damage in terms of color, going from green to red as the unit or building got more damaged. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but this was a small moment of genius from the developers that I don't think even they realized at the time. There was also the introduction of unit stuns, which were spells designed to immobilize single or large groups of units. Well, to be fair, the entire plethora of StarCraft spells has to be some of the most unique ideas ever inserted into an RTS game. But again, we will talk about this in a later video. This mechanic of stun is a big deal, especially when you consider how it eventually became a core mechanic of the entire MOBA genre. That all came from StarCraft. Next, StarCraft also introduced the concept of a unit cap. 200 supply was all you got. In Warcraft II or Red Alert, you could basically build as large an army as your resources allowed. I believe there was a unit cap in Warcraft II, but it was more due to the software limitations rather than gameplay limitations. In StarCraft, this meant that unit composition and balance between armies and workers was now a much bigger consideration. But on top of the unit cap came a whole new way of supply management, where in the earlier Warcrafts, each farm basically allowed you to build any 4 units because all units took the same amount of supply. StarCraft introduced the idea of certain larger, more powerful units taking up more supply than others. The supply farms all produced 8 supply each, but smaller basic units took up 1 supply, and some of the biggest units took up 8 supply. Another thing StarCraft added was production queues and unit command queues. You could now queue up to 5 units to produce in a building and give up to 10 consecutive commands to each unit. Then came Brood War. And I'm gonna tell you now that the next episode is going to be all about Brood War, so don't you worry, we are going to cover the greatest expansion in the history of video games in full depth. But for now, Brood War followed the vein of what Beyond the Dark Portal did, mostly being a story and single-player campaign expansion, but also introduced us to 2 new units per race. Well, technically 3 when it came to the Protoss. And it might not sound like much when you put it like that, but you will probably note that the fact that I'm making a series of videos dedicated to this game probably indicates that this was the peak of Blizzard RTS games. But for now, let's forge ahead. Next came Warcraft III. Warcraft III introduced us to even more damage types and armor types, this time including buildings into the picture. We were also given hero units, hero equipables and consumables, mercenaries for hire, markets for shopping, 4 races now, auto-casting of spells, and also more intelligent spellcasting, day and night cycles, and a whole new economic mechanic of upkeep. Upkeep meant that once your army passed a certain size, your resources collected per cycle were scaled down a certain percentage. This mechanic was also enforced through Warcraft's now smaller supply cap of 90. Units themselves took up a much more significant amount of supply, forcing armies to be much smaller, lending focus to heroes and tactics instead of just army production. With the lower supply cap essentially allowing for smaller, more maneuverable armies, Warcraft III decided to create bigger and longer battles by bumping the health to damage ratio of their units to a ridiculous degree. Put this in perspective for a second, alright? A Marine in StarCraft has 40 health and does 6 damage. A Footman in Warcraft 3 does 12 damage and has a whopping 420 health. This meant that armies generally took longer to kill and allowed for all sorts of control play. One small but incredibly significant change that Warcraft 3 added was the idle worker icon, which allowed players to identify idle workers immediately and select them simply by clicking the icon on the screen. This was a huge change from StarCraft, which often made you lose track of your workers that you sent around the map, and sometimes even those in your own base. Interestingly though, Warcraft 3 still kept 12 units to a control group, but with the added controls of tabbing through the different types of units within the group to effectively cast spells. Warcraft 3 also added the ability to group select your buildings to produce from them at the same time and bumped the unit queue up to 7. And it added a couple of small changes to the way supply worked once more, this time introducing a very slight variation in the cost of building the supply farms for the humans and how much supply they provided, but the increased cost in farms for each of the other races also came with more utility for those buildings, acting as static defense structures in some cases and restorative structures in others. The economics changed once again, this time taking a cue from StarCraft and going with a much more reduced income of 10 per resource gathering cycle. But at the same time, units were still pretty pricey. This worked together with the idea of smaller armies in Warcraft and more tactical play and control rather than just straight up production. As an aside here, I've always wondered what a Warcraft game would feel like in the StarCraft engine, with footmen and archers all costing like 1 supply and having 5 control groups of units smash against each other. I'm sure there's a mod for this somewhere. I should go and try and find one really. And then we get to the last of the expansions in the RTS genre, the Frozen Throne. Frozen Throne introduced similar fare from Blizzard's expansion strategy, a continuation of the story and single-player campaign, new units for each race, a new hero for each race, a couple of new mercenary heroes, and a bunch of new buildings. One of these buildings was a merchant that you could buy generic hero items from, which put even more emphasis on the hero as the main focal point of combat in Warcraft. They bumped the supply cap to 100, but kept the upkeep mechanics as is. And they also did technically introduce 2 new races into play, but not really as proper playable races in the multiplayer aspect of the game, the Naga and the Draenei. And lastly, Frozen Throne brought back naval units and introduced amphibian mechanics to the game, though this was once again not a big part of the game, really only playing a role in single player. And of course, it cannot be overstated how Frozen Throne did give rise to the MOBA genre completely, with its introduction of the wide array of heroes and custom maps utilizing those heroes and hero items. And now we finally arrive at the last entries into the RTS genre, StarCraft II in its 3 iterations.
Hell, it's about time.
Now, we can consider StarCraft II to be a game with 2 expansions, or 3 versions of the same game, or 2 experimental attempts before the actual StarCraft II real game. Whatever it is, StarCraft II came deliberately in 3 chunks, which came with their own mechanics and wildly changed the way the game played over the years. Let's start off with what Wings of Liberty brought to the table. The first SC2 entry gave us a whole series of changes to the mechanics of StarCraft, and while comparisons between StarCraft and Warcraft may demonstrate large differences, the comparisons between the 2 StarCrafts is far more interesting. SC2 shifted so much of the mechanical difficulty of the game to automated systems. Some consider them quality of life changes, but their impact is far greater than that. It is also important to note that this is the longest wait between iterations of a game, even considering the entire genre of Blizzard RTS games. That meant that there were huge leaps in game hardware and software to allow for much bigger changes to be made. So let's try and go down this list. Firstly, StarCraft fundamentally changed how workers worked. You started with far more, they were far more intelligent when it came to selecting mineral patches, and had a fixed number associated to each mineral patch to standardize optimization. In original StarCraft, you kind of had to guess if you were optimized with how many workers you had collecting minerals, but in SC2 that was fully automated. You could also rally workers to automatically start mining immediately after being produced. Quick note, this was a feature introduced in Warcraft III. I forgot to mention it because it's just too many games to keep track of all the mechanics. Next came the change once again in the economics of the game, bringing the resource per cycle down to 5 but maintaining most of the unit and building prices close to Brood War. And of course, the introduction of the standardized 2 gases per base, which is something that Brood War map makers fixed but SC2 standardized. SC2 kept the supply cap at 200 and largely kept Brood War's approach to supply usage. The main structures all received a bump in starting supply by 1 to account for the increase in starting workers. But the biggest change by far was SC2's decision to allow unlimited units per group. But unlike Red Alert or Red Alert 2, the pathing AI was now much smarter and kept units together in a big ball, which meant a much easier time moving large armies around. Units were also much smarter at moving around structures, which meant that you could clump your production structures together without the fear of units getting stuck when they came out. And on top of this, it also gave you a select all units button, which you could use at any time. There's a lot to say about this change, but we're going to gloss over this for now and come back to this point later. One of the small mechanics SC2 introduced was the inclusion of some units that could now move over cliffs, changing the way high and low ground worked, but this is quite insignificant in the later parts of the game. And the rest of the new things SC2 introduced came in the form of all the new unit-specific mechanics, but nothing that was fundamentally different to the large overall gameplay changes. Most of these things were changed to increase the speed of the gameplay, whether by automating systems in the game that were once all manually performed by players in previous games, or by actually making things physically faster in the game. One specific example of this was the fundamental way creep worked for the Zerg, where in Brood War it was simply required to create structures on. SC2 changed it as a core mechanic of the game, making all Zerg units move faster on it. Another example of physical speed changes in the game are actual unit move speeds, and even things like how fast Terran buildings moved when lifted off. All this is to say that the final speed of the game is overall very much faster, and an interesting byproduct of that is that also most SC2 maps are a lot bigger than SC1 maps. This, coupled together with the way units moved around structures, meant that building space management was no longer very important. Then came Heart of the Swarm. Now, Heart of the Swarm is very much a typical Blizzard expansion more than an iteration of Wings, but the scope of what changed in the multiplayer aspect of the game was much larger compared to Brood War or Frozen Throne. Much of this stemmed from the fact that Blizzard wanted to maintain both games independently, giving them each their own competitive ladder. Heart of the Swarm introduced an array of new units with new abilities that shifted the balance in speed and tactics of the game enough that the strategies from Wings did not carry over at all. But there weren't any really new mechanics introduced, no new aspects of the game that needed to be learned aside from the overall balance and how the new units integrated into play. Legacy, however, would be where some of the biggest changes were made, and it's where we find ourselves today. The biggest thing Legacy changed was bumping up the starting workers from 6 to 12, making the start of games far more active immediately. This also meant a bump of supply from the main structures from 11 to 15, the unit lineups were finalized, and eventually Legacy would come to be known as the de facto StarCraft II experience and competition. But it is interesting to note that SC2 is still receiving balance patches today. I'm going to come back to this point in a different video talking about balance, but part of it is going to be addressed here. Whew. So there we go. That's a somewhat detailed but certainly not comprehensive look at the history of the evolution of the Blizzard RTS. We find StarCraft Brood War sitting kind of right in the middle of the entire timeline. And as someone who has played all of these games and watched competitive play in all of them, yes, including Warcraft 1, StarCraft still sticks out as something quite special. And the rest of this video is going to be me explaining why. As you can see, even the OG StarCraft 1 brought in a bunch of ideas that completely changed the landscape of how these games played. Let's start with the economics of the game. With Warcraft, much of the resource collection was a passive ordeal. You could have any number of workers on gold, the primary resource, because they didn't need to take turns. And the secondary resource was often optimized by a few workers as well. StarCraft flipped the script by making the primary resource gathering something that you needed to actively manage. This meant the act of creating workers, pulling workers to do other tasks, and managing workers as a significant portion of the total units you have in the game became a far more involved ordeal. If you go and listen to some of the early stories about players figuring out the path to victory in multiplayer competitive play, you learn that expanding and taking multiple bases didn't come intuitively to the players because of how resource collection and management was very much a passive experience in most previous RTS games. Even back in the Westwood era, harvesters were completely automated, and while you could build additional harvesters to speed things up, you didn't need to think about optimizing both the number of total workers and the distance they needed to travel to gather those resources. You also weren't constantly producing new workers in the much later stages of the game. So in a world of maybe 10 or 15 workers max in the previous Warcrafts, StarCraft's emphasis on resource collection and management eventually put total worker counts at close to 50 or 60 in total, and sometimes even more. And because StarCraft had not automated any of these systems, every single worker needed to be controlled individually. Compare this with SC2, where you could set a rally point for your workers on the resource they need to gather, and when the workers popped out, they would immediately get to work. StarCraft required you to give them orders immediately, or they just sit there and do nothing. Setting a rally point on the minerals would make them walk right next to the resource, but not collect it. But it was even more than this. In SC2, you could essentially select a whole group of workers and command them to gather resources, and they would all divvy themselves up to the point of optimization, 3 workers per mineral patch. In Warcraft, you could click on any random tree in the forest and the workers would chop at whatever was in front of them. In StarCraft, you select 10 workers and right-click a mineral patch, and all of them would go to that specific one and try and gather from it. The AI would allow them to go to the immediate next patch sometimes if the one in front of them was occupied, but not all the time and not beyond that. They would have to return back to the base, go back to the mineral patch, discover that it was then occupied, and then maybe kind of move to the next one. So in a big group of 12 workers going to one mineral patch, maybe 2 of those workers would turn to the ones on either side, but the rest would just sit there and wait for their friends to be done before they got to work. This, coupled with the fact that StarCraft gave you just 4 workers at the start, meant that optimizing them right from the get-go was essential. This skill, known as worker splitting, is something pros take years to master. I've been playing this game for 25 years and I still can't do it properly. And as tedious as it seems, the fact that StarCraft made this a complicated and involved part of the game is part of what makes it so good. It placed a certain level of importance on pure mechanical skill, which meant that if you just worked hard enough at it and got good at the mechanical aspect of the game, something so fundamental like controlling and optimizing your workers, you could already do so much better than a bunch of other players. Imagine, if you will, if chessboards were huge, like gigantic, and chess pieces were incredibly heavy, and you needed to physically carry and move your pieces around. Instead of a strictly mental strategy game, you could also now train physically to just lift and move your pieces faster than your scrawny opponent. That's kind of what StarCraft does. it extends the concept of what the game is all about, strategically complex, but mechanically challenging. And I think StarCraft is the only game in the entire genre to do this. Warcraft III and StarCraft II returned to automated systems for worker management, and I feel that while this made the games easier to play and focused more on the strategies, the execution aspect of it was definitely far more interesting in StarCraft. And even more on top of this, the emphasis on workers being a larger part of the game meant that StarCraft was the first real RTS that opened up the floodgates to what became known as economical damage in competitive matches. Suddenly, whole new strategies of trading combat units for worker units, dropping assaults on mining workers to wipe out the amount of income an enemy player had, all became absolutely fundamental strategies in the game that added yet another layer of complexity to competitive play. And before we talk about the big one, let's return for a second with StarCraft's new UI, the new unit icon damage display at the bottom of the screen. This is such a small little thing, but it is a fundamentally important concept that changed the entire way the game played. So many games after this would copy this idea because of just how intuitive it is. Based on this information alone, it was now possible to control large armies and make very quick assessments of the health of these armies with a single glance. And while you could argue that the health bar in Warcraft achieved the same thing, the way in which StarCraft delivered this information was far more intuitive, and it just makes so much sense. The change in colors from green to yellow to red gave a perfect aggregate of the current health and strength of your army at a quick glance, and because you were cycling through several control groups most of the time, this was absolutely revolutionary. I cannot stress how incredible this tiny little change is, and I don't think even people who play the game think about it all that much, but when you jump between games like I do, you quickly find just how genius and intuitive the SCUI is. Okay, let's take a deep breath and talk about control groups. Okay, I'm just gonna say this, it's gonna be controversial, but I'm gonna stand behind it. 12 is surprisingly the magic number. I'm not even going to say it's a subjective thing. I think 12 is objectively the best number for a single control group. It's almost crazy how well 12 in a control group works. It feels arbitrary, but at the same time not. Like 10 would feel bad, and 14 would somehow not make the same amount of sense. 12 was small enough to be exact enough in precisely commanding your army, and at the same time large enough to encompass your entire army. With the total supply armies ate up and how many workers you needed, most maxed armies were in the realm of 40 to 60 units, easily controlled by 4 to 5 control groups, which would be easily controlled by your 4 to 5 fingers. Okay. We're gonna have to step aside for a moment from the conversation about control groups to talk about unit pathing. I touched a little on this in my esports video, but I'll recap it here. The unit pathing in StarCraft kind of sucks ass. It wasn't such a big deal when playing Warcraft because you generally didn't have that large of an army, what with the high production cost of units and the inability to control that many units at a time with no control groups. But StarCraft forced players to manage larger armies by necessity of its economic scale, and that led to the necessity of some kind of AI pathing. To explain the concept of pathing to a non-RTS player, think of it this way. When you command a group of units to move from one place to the next, all those units need to do this at the same time. In order to do that, the computer has to calculate the most optimal path for each unit and stop them from colliding into each other and somewhat arrive there at the same time to be considered an effective command. Now, players of StarCraft II will note that this is ultimately solved in that iteration of the game, with group units effectively acting like one big beehive when you clump them together, and they never get in their own way. They move together and arrive together and, to me anyways, look very weirdly organized and organic, like a blob creature. StarCraft 1, on the other hand, didn't really solve this problem of pathing at all. They just did the best that they could with whatever code they managed to make work, and while you can issue commands to all 12 units at the same time, the results were often far less than optimal. Most of the time, the individual unit pathing would calculate the exact same path to reach the destination, meaning that the units tended to crash into one another, blocking each other and causing them to reshuffle their positions over and over again until you eventually ended up with a conga line of units. Now, as I said, this is somewhat workable because it still meant that the units would travel sort of together and arrive at the destination sort of at the same time, but in a rather ridiculous, clumsy, and inefficient way. The conga line also made them far more susceptible to ambushes and far less effective against certain types of defensive setups. For instance, running a conga line of infinite amounts of Zerglings into just a couple of siege tanks resulted in basically a big pool of Zerg blood and nothing else. And because some units in particular had turning animations before they could change directions, sometimes the crashing into each other would also result in units spinning round and round for no particular reason, causing major delays in moving out. All that is to say that moving armies around can be incredibly frustrating in StarCraft. But the beauty of this once again comes in the fact that because something is difficult and inconvenient, it forces the player to develop a brand new set of skills.
Enter Micro.
Micromanagement, or Micro for short, very quickly became a core skill in the world of StarCraft, and in fact the entire RTS genre. Units were generally dumb in their pathing, but you could constantly override their automatic interpretation of the commands by issuing new commands in all sorts of ways, almost like steering a large ship. You could essentially account for the formation of the conga line and try and keep units bunched up by issuing commands in opposite directions every now and then. You could force units at the front to move further than the group destination point to allow the back units more space to arrive, or ask the units to move further in and sustain fire just to get a better position before launching your attack. This was such a big and important part of StarCraft that games were won and lost purely based on how well some players managed to manipulate their armies around the map. The idea that Micro was something that you could get good at, and the fact that it was one of the deciding factors between victory and defeat, also meant that players would spend large amounts of time picking apart different methods of how every single minute movement could be optimized. I mean, it is called micromanagement after all, not just management. This gave rise to a whole bunch of unique things in the game of StarCraft that we don't really see anywhere else. Players invented new ways of bunching units together in a group like Mutalisks, using hold position to increase the rate at which Dragoons stopped and started firing, keeping fast units like Vultures moving while timing their shots according to their range and attack speeds, and so on and so on. But my favorite example of these is the worker drill. Allow me to explain. Going back to the emphasis of workers being a thing in StarCraft 1, the fact that you needed to have several workers per mineral patch meant that workers needed to inhabit the same physical space at any given time, or you'd create the ultimate traffic jam around the resources. But the workers still needed to physically be there when they were not collecting minerals, otherwise you could just ghost through everything in the world. Blizzard's solution to this problem was to allow workers to ghost through other units whenever you directed a worker to specifically collect or return a resource, including gas geysers that didn't have the collection building created yet. So, by ordering a worker to collect a resource, you temporarily made that unit a ghost that allowed it to overlap onto another unit. But the second you overrode that command, the worker unit would assume its physical space again. But because no two ground units could occupy the same physical space, this meant that the stacked workers or units would cause the units to reshuffle themselves until they were all spread out again. And this movement would take absolute priority over any other command any other units were currently under. This meant that even if enemy attacking units were mid-attack, Ghosting a worker onto that enemy unit and then reinstating that worker would force the enemy unit to stop everything it was currently doing and shuffle itself until it occupied its own space again before resuming its initial command. So you've already guessed it by now, but this became an actual strategy used in competitive play. Sometimes when a small initial army would come and try and harass the enemy worker line, the players would gather up their workers, click on the resource in roughly the direction of the attacking army, ghost into them, and then override that command with either a stop move or an attack, which caused the attacking army to start glitching out and reshuffling. Sometimes the reshuffle would be so bad that the defensive forces could even kill the attacking army while they were busy doing their little shuffle dance. This became known as worker drilling. And all this came from the simple necessity to have more workers in the mineral line without causing a traffic jam. And after all that, we now come back to the number 12. 12 seems to be the perfect number to allow for the most efficient levels of micro. Obviously, you could also create smaller groups, but you rarely ever needed more than 12, because controlling more than 12 StarCraft 1 units at a time is almost going to be impossible. But 12 seems to work just enough to where good micro skills can overcome bad AI pathing, and that makes all the difference. But this whole problem also allowed for one last little thing to occur in the competitive scene in StarCraft. Because you could only control up to 12 units at a time, and because of all the million other things you needed to do, like build your structures, manually produce from each individual structure, produce workers, give instructions to those workers, StarCraft had an incredible rubber banding mechanic built into the game. It's hard to say whether this was ever intentional, but what this ended up creating was a situation where the bigger and more powerful your army got, the harder it became to keep control over the game. This meant that players with smaller armies and fewer bases actually had a slight advantage when it came to executing more tactical battles and counterattacks and sneaky ambushes, and so supply discrepancy between armies was never the final deciding factor in who came out on top. And I think that's what makes StarCraft so magical. There are just so many things that players have to control and master that it means that everyone kind of has a chance in the game. You had the people who were just faster than everyone else mechanically, and then you had the people who were just so clever with their strategies and build orders, and all of this was slightly different for each individual race. And of course, we will eventually talk about balance in StarCraft, because it is a game that hasn't had a balance patch for more than 20 years, unlike its younger sibling, but it still remains balanced and viable in competition until today. And as I said, I'm dedicating a whole nother video to just talking about the mystical, magical balance of StarCraft, because there's just so much to talk about, so please stay tuned for that one. But speaking of balance, there is something else here that I'd like to point out that StarCraft did so amazingly well, and it's almost impossible to comprehend. While in Warcraft you essentially had to account for two races and most of the units were direct mirrors of each other, StarCraft had to balance three races, and the fact that they did not end up with a rock paper scissors game is nothing short of miraculous. Each matchup is equally viable, even the mirror matchups. There is not a case where a triangle of strengths and weaknesses form and you basically win outright depending on which one you pick. Every race has a fighting chance against every race. Every type of unit is somewhat viable in a fight. Except for Devourers, but we'll talk about them later. Let's lastly talk about the numbers one more time, because I think StarCraft hit the magic number here once again. With games like Warcraft 1, the damage number scaled faster than the unit hit points as you went up the tech tree. An example of this is the difference between the most basic unit like the Footman and the most advanced unit, the Demon. The Demon scales up to 300 hit points from the Footman's 60, but the damage of the Demon scales to 65 from the Footman's 9. Warcraft II tried to tackle the problem in the reverse, but that meant that the health and damage of the units barely scaled at all. An example of this is how the most basic and most advanced units only range from 60 to 100 hit points, and damage numbers going from 6 to 16 without upgrades. This got even worse in Warcraft III, in that basic units basically felt like they took forever to kill, especially if you didn't have the correct damage types. Units were dealing 10 to 20 damage while having 4 to 700 HP, some of them even more than 1000 HP. And while StarCraft II didn't change that much of the damage and health numbers from StarCraft I, because of how mechanically fluid things were, the DPS you could put out with your whole army felt a lot higher. It's not really that the actual DPS is much more when you look at the numbers, but because armies moved into position with that much more efficiency, it almost guaranteed your units to be in a better position to deal damage, and so the overall output felt constantly higher. If you watch an SC2 versus an SC1 match, you can kind of see armies and bases fall apart that much faster in StarCraft II. But that means that the time frame for counterattacks and defensive moves is that much smaller. This is where StarCraft I is really brilliant. Engages were all very involved, but also left so much room for responsive actions. It hits this really sweet spot where damage is dealt at a really significant rate even with small armies, but at the same time, even with huge armies, the damage was somehow manageable, and you could almost always mount some kind of response there and then. It also makes StarCraft 1 matches that much more interesting to watch, because you had time to kind of digest everything that was going on. StarCraft 2 matches kind of feel like all the meaty blobs just evaporate all at once. Ever try to follow what happens when a bunch of banelings go up against a bunch of marines? Honestly, I can barely ever tell what is going on in the moment itself. I don't know if the marines are killing the banelings or the banelings are killing the marines. They just all explode and just... Look, we're almost an hour in, and I titled this video The Beginnings of Greatness, so I want to stop here for now and say that this isn't a comprehensive exploration of the entire game, and by no means does this mean that all those other RTS games are worse. Well, they are, but that's fine. They're all still really enjoyable. But in my opinion, and my opinion is very well informed, as you can see, StarCraft 1 beats them all. It's funny to think that all the things that I think make StarCraft great are a result of both the optimizations it made and the optimizations it didn't make. That's why StarCraft is a bad game, but it's what makes it a great game. Well, I say that, but StarCraft 1 isn't the greatest RTS ever made. There is one other that is truly greater.